Hey guys, tonight we begin with something hidden in plain sight. The Victorian bedroom, a place of lace, luxury, and supposed refinement. At least that's what the paintings and museum displays want you to believe. The truth is far stranger. Behind those heavy curtains and carved headboards lurked filth, superstition, and secrets best left in the shadows. And the more respectable the surface looked, the darker the stains underneath. Before we get started, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you actually enjoy these sleepy dives into history, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing our map of night owls and insomniacs light up around the world. Now dim the lights, let the hum of your fan or heater fade into the background, and let's step quietly inside. Congratulations, you've just stepped into a Victorian bedroom. The good news, you're surrounded by velvet curtains, polished mahogany, and enough lace to strangle an entire generation. The bad news, that lace is hiding more dirt than you want to think about, and not just the literal kind. You lie back in that massive four-poster bed, curtains drawn tight, the fire fading to embers, and now the real strangeness begins. Sleep in the Victorian age was less a peaceful retreat, and more a nightly negotiation between superstition, poor hygiene, and a society terrified of its own desires. The bedroom was not just a room to rest. It was a stage where health, morality, and fear all collided under the same moth-eaten quilt. Victorians did not believe in sleep as we understand it. They saw it as both dangerous and necessary, a time when the body could be invaded by spirits or weakened by the wrong habits. Doctors of the time insisted that sleeping with windows open was a direct invitation to disease. The miasma theory, the idea that foul air carried illness, shaped nearly every decision. So those heavy curtains stayed closed, and the air inside became stale, damp, and filled with smoke. It was like trying to drift off inside a slowly fermenting closet. Sleep was often divided into two phases. People would rest for a few hours, wake up in the middle of the night, and then return for a second sleep. That quiet gap in the dark was not idle time. It was used for prayer, reflection, or activities that polite society did not discuss in daylight. Manuals from the era quietly hinted that husbands and wives might take advantage of that interval for intimacy, while others turned to their Bibles or wrote letters by candlelight. Imagine rolling over at 2 a.m. and deciding whether to pray or procreate. Both were considered spiritually restorative in their own ways. The bed itself was a fortress of germs and gossip. Mattresses were rarely replaced, often stuffed with horsehair or straw that held onto every bit of moisture. Sweat, soot, coal dust and fleas collected with every passing year. A proper house might cover the bed with crisp linens, but those linens were boiled maybe once a month, twice if you were particularly ambitious. In wealthy homes, servants did the laundry, often with caustic chemicals that left the sheets stiff and stinking faintly of lye. For the middle classes, washing meant hours of scrubbing by hand, which meant it was avoided as long as possible. The result was that climbing into bed was closer to climbing into a compost pile dressed up in lace. Superstition dictated many of the rituals that went along with sleep. Some people placed Bibles under their pillows to ward off nightmares. Others kept iron objects nearby to repel spirits. Coins under the pillow were thought to prevent possession by ghosts or demons. For women, hair was often braided or bound before bed, not just to keep it neat, but because loose hair was thought to attract evil influences during the night. The modern phrase letting your hair down carried much more risk when people thought it might also let in the devil. Even the act of sharing a bed was riddled with contradictions. In poorer homes, entire families might pile into one mattress, children wedged between adults, cousins sleeping crosswise at the foot. Privacy was non-existent, and so was personal space. In wealthier homes, married couples often slept separately. Twin beds became fashionable not only for health reasons, but as a way of maintaining moral appearances. Sleeping apart suggested control and propriety. Yet many of these couples still visited each other's beds during the night, a quiet rebellion against their own rules. Doctors also worried constantly about the dangers of nocturnal habits. too much sleep was considered a sign of weakness. Too little was a sign of vice. A healthy person was supposed to rise early and retire modestly, though this advice was more wishful thinking than reality. Victorian medical journals are filled with anxious warnings about masturbation, a word they often avoided even while dedicating entire chapters to it. The act was believed to drain vitality, corrupt morals, and led to madness. Entire industries of devices, ointments, and lockable contraptions were created to prevent it. Parents were advised to monitor children's sleep, to check that blankets were tucked tightly, hands above the covers, and bodies properly aligned to avoid temptation. Nothing kills the romance of bedtime faster than your parents peeking in to make sure you have not moved your hands. Nightwear was its own performance. Women wore long nightgowns that doubled as a form of modesty armour. Men wore nightshirts that looked more like oversized dresses. Both were designed less for comfort and more for covering every possible inch of flesh. The irony is that these heavy garments trapped heat and sweat, adding to the already unbearable environment of the room. Sleeping naked, though healthier, was considered scandalous. Yet diaries and court records show plenty of people ignored the rule when given the chance, proving once again that comfort usually wins over custom when the curtains are drawn. The bedroom also became the site of nighttime medical rituals. Patent medicines promising better sleep were everywhere. Bottles of laudanum, a tincture of opium sat on nightstands in respectable homes. It was prescribed for everything from insomnia to indigestion, but it also dulled pain and created dependency. Entire generations drifted off each night in a haze of narcotics, quietly addicted while maintaining the outward appearance of respectability. And then there were the noises. Victorian homes creaked and groaned, fires sputtered, pipes clanged. Superstition turned every sound into a potential haunting. Sleep manuals advised keeping candles and matches nearby to ward off spirits or burglars. Ghost stories were not just entertainment, they were explanations for the unsettling reality of sleeping in cold, dark, unhealthy rooms. Your cough might be caused by coal smoke, but it was easier to blame a phantom hand on your chest. You shift in the bed, the smell of soot and damp wool thick around you, the curtains closing in like a coffin. The quiet is not peace, it is pressure. You're expected to rest, to restore your body, to keep your morals intact. Yet every aspect of this bedroom, from the mattress that crawls to the wallpaper that poisons, makes the task almost impossible. What should be a sanctuary is more of a trap, and the real secrets of Victorian life are not whispered in parlours, but soaked into the very sheets. And if this is how they slept, just wait until you learn how they handled what came after waking. Because the morning rituals of the Victorian bedroom reveal even stranger contradictions than the night. The curtains are finally pulled open, and the first thing that hits you is not sunlight, but the heavy odour of the chamber pot under the bed. Before modern plumbing, this porcelain bowl, or sometimes just a plain metal pail, was the household toilet of choice, and though they were emptied each morning, emptied was a generous term. Servants carried them downstairs, splashing their contents into larger waste tubs, or in poorer households it was tossed straight into the gutter. Imagine beginning your day in the 19th century with the sound of sloshing urine making its way down a hallway. That was as regular as the rooster crow. Chamber pots were not simply functional. They became fashionable objects decorated with painted flowers, family crests, or witty slogans glazed into the ceramic. Guests might even be offered their own pot for the night, a gesture of hospitality that was as practical as it was humiliating. Archaeologists still find these vessels hidden under floorboards or discarded in rubbish heaps, stained reminders of a time when indoor plumbing was more dream than reality. And while wealthier homes eventually installed water closets, even those early designs often flushed waste into cesspits that leaked into groundwater. Nothing says good morning like drinking tea drawn from the same source as last night's chamber pot. If you are fortunate enough to be part of the rising middle class, your morning ritual might include a washstand in the corner of your bedroom. These wooden pieces of furniture held a basin and pitcher filled with cold water. Washing was brisk, minimal and often incomplete. Splash the face, rinse the hands, perhaps dab a cloth behind the ears. Full baths were rare, sometimes taken only weekly, and often considered dangerous. Medical authorities warned that immersing the body in water too often weakened the constitution and left pores dangerously open to illness. Cleanliness, in Victorian terms, meant being socially acceptable, not necessarily free of grime. Soap itself was often harsh, laced with alkali that stripped skin raw, so most people used it sparingly. Morning breath was another silent enemy. Toothbrushes did exist, made of bone and bristles, but toothpaste was experimental at best. Some used crushed charcoal, others baking soda or chalk. One recipe recommended a mixture of honey and ground cuttlefish bone. The result was a smile that might look white enough, but behind it lay a mouthful of decay. Dental hygiene was considered cosmetic rather than essential, and toothaches were so common that many people assumed losing teeth was just part of aging. Nothing put romance on hold faster than the shared realization that both of you smelled faintly of coal smoke and rotting molars. The bedroom was also the site of another daily ritual, dressing. Victorian fashion required layers, and layers required effort. Women pulled on chemises, corsets, petticoats, stockings and gowns. Men donned shirts, waistcoats and trousers before stepping into tailored coats. Dressing was not just about appearance. It was a daily act of constructing respectability, of making sure the outside world saw only restraint and discipline, even if the inside world was rotting from lice and arsenic wallpaper. Corsets were laced tight, restricting breathing but shaping the body into the fashionable silhouette of the time. Doctors warned about compressed lungs, displaced organs and fainting fits, but fashion trumped anatomy every morning. In poorer homes the process was far less elegant. Clothes were patched and repatched, often worn until the fabric was little more than a suggestion of its original form. The same garments doubled as nightwear, daywear, and workwear. Children might share hand-me-downs until the buttons no longer held, and yet even here, the act of dressing carried symbolic weight. A clean collar or apron could make the difference between respect and suspicion. In a society obsessed with appearances, what you wore mattered more than how long it had been since you last washed it. The smells of the morning clung to the room long after you left it. Coal fires left soot on the walls and ceilings, turning white paint to yellow within a few years. Gas lamps leaked fumes, mixing with human sweat and the ammonia of chamber pots. The air was stale, heavy, and sometimes dangerous. Doctors recorded cases of carbon monoxide poisoning from improperly vented fireplaces. But the average Victorian shrugged it off, believing instead that open windows invited illness. So curtains stayed drawn, stale air thickened, and headaches became part of daily life. Privacy was limited, even in bedrooms. In large households, servants moved in and out of rooms to light fires, deliver hot water, or collect laundry. Middle-class homes often shared beds between siblings or even visiting relatives. Boarding houses and lodging rooms packed multiple strangers into the same bedroom, sometimes separated only by curtains. Intimacy, in the modern sense, was rare. Victorian bedrooms were crowded, noisy, and always faintly public, no matter how private they appeared. And here lies one of the greatest contradictions of the era. The same society that built bedrooms into shrines of modesty filled those very rooms with realities that mocked the idea of purity. Chamber pots steaming under the bed, lice in the linens, laudanum bottles rattling on nightstands. Each morning began not with serenity, but with a negotiation between survival and respectability. The very place that was supposed to reflect restraint became instead a space of endless compromise. You notice it now, as you stand in the centre of the room. The wallpaper curls at the edges from damp, its green hue glinting faintly with arsenic. The air is sour with coal dust and ammonia. The wash basin in the corner holds water already cloudy after one quick rinse, and on the dresser sits a Bible beside a small glass bottle of smelling salts, a pairing that says everything about the Victorian approach to life, a balance of faith, fainting, and filth. The bedroom might look immaculate when the door is closed to visitors, but by morning light its secrets are impossible to ignore. This was not a sanctuary. It was a crucible of contradictions, a place where you were judged not only by how you lived, but by how convincingly you hid the evidence of how you actually lived. And as the day begins in this suffocating room, you start to wonder how people managed to live entire lifetimes in spaces that were both shrines and sewers. But the strangeness of Victorian bedrooms was not confined to rituals of sleep and waking. It extended to the very design of the furniture itself, and to the objects Victorians insisted on surrounding themselves with. Even as those objects slowly poisoned them, the furniture itself looms around you, not merely functional but symbolic, designed to impress, suffocate, and sometimes slowly kill. A Victorian bedroom was a museum of contradictions, filled with objects that looked refined while hiding hazards that today would come with warning labels. The four-poster bed dominated the room like an altar, heavy wood carved with Gothic details, often draped in fabric so thick it absorbed both sound and smell. To own such a bed was a mark of success, but to sleep in one was to trap yourself in a box of stale air. Those curtains did not just block drafts, they blocked ventilation, turning the bed into a greenhouse for disease. Doctors of the time warned against stuffy sleeping quarters, but fashion prevailed. After all, you could not host polite society in your home unless your bedroom demonstrated moral seriousness through furniture that doubled as punishment. Wallpaper was more than decoration. It was a silent accomplice in the slow poisoning of households. Vibrant green patterns, popular in middle and upper class homes, often relied on arsenic-based dyes. The chemical gave walls a luminous sheen, but as the paper aged, microscopic flakes drifted into the air. Inhaling or touching it could cause rashes, headaches, or worse. Children were especially vulnerable, their cribs lined against glowing green walls that glittered like jewels while quietly leaching toxins. Manufacturers denied the problem, arguing that only poorly ventilated rooms were dangerous, which was ironic given that Victorians also believed windows should stay closed at night. It was the perfect trap, where your pursuit of fashionable decor made your bedroom indistinguishable from a gas chamber. Taxidermy found its way into bedrooms as well. Stuffed birds, foxes, or even exotic animals imported from the colonies sat perched on mantels or mounted in glass domes. These displays were not just curiosities, they were social statements, proof of education, wealth, and imperial reach. Yet they also filled the air with the scent of formaldehyde and decay. To fall asleep under the glassy stare of a stuffed owl while breathing fumes of preservation fluid was considered tasteful. It was also another reminder that in Victorian design, beauty was measured by how well you endured discomfort. The obsession with clutter did not stop there. Nightstands were often covered with trinkets, photographs, hair keepsakes, and religious tokens. Morning jewellery, containing locks of hair from deceased relatives, sometimes rested inches from the bed. Death was a constant presence, and Victorians felt compelled to surround themselves with mementos of it. A respectable room might include a portrait of a lost child, a rosary, or even a small coffin-shaped trinket box. Imagine falling asleep with a constant reminder that mortality was not only outside your door, but on top of your dresser. Lighting was another hazard disguised as progress. Gas lamps flickered on walls, casting soft glows but releasing carbon monoxide into the room. Fires were common, sparked when curtains or bedclothes brushed too near the open flames. Those who could afford candles often used tallow, which filled the air with a greasy odour. Beeswax was cleaner but expensive, and so many Victorians drifted off to the faint hiss of gas or the sputter of fat burning lulled into unconsciousness by fumes that modern building inspectors would declare uninhabitable. Floors were cluttered with rugs and carpets, often layered to insulate against cold drafts. These were rarely cleaned properly and quickly became traps for soot, ash, and insect eggs. Beating carpets outdoors was a seasonal task, creating great clouds of filth that settled right back into the home. Beneath these rugs, the wood often warped from damp or cracked from soot. The polished appearance of a Victorian bedroom was like a theatre set, convincing from a distance but rotten beneath. Even objects of comfort carried risks. Feather pillows harboured mites, while wool blankets absorbed years of sweat. Quilts were stitched from recycled fabric that sometimes carried disease from one family to another. Hand-me-down bedding was common, passed through generations not because it was safe, but because it was available. To rest your head each night was to trust a patchwork of history that came with every germ stitched in. The Victorians filled their rooms with symbols of morality. Religious texts sat beside bottles of patent medicine. Bibles were displayed prominently on nightstands, while drawers hid items less respectable. This duality was not hypocrisy so much as survival. Respectability was a performance, and the bedroom was both stage and backstage. To an outside guest, the room was orderly, pious, and filled with reminders of restraint. To those who actually slept there, it was a carnival of discomfort, danger, and quiet rebellion. Superstition even shaped furniture placement. Beds were often positioned away from mirrors, since it was thought that reflections could trap souls during sleep. Some avoided placing beds directly under windows for fear of spirits entering. Others tucked talismans into drawers or behind frames. These habits reflected a culture that lived with constant reminders of death and disease, where even the layout of a room was a negotiation with unseen forces. You step back and take in the scene. A glowing green wallpaper that poisons the air, curtains that choke circulation, rugs that crawl with mites, taxidermy that stares with dead eyes, and a nightstand where sacred texts sit beside bottles of opium. This was not an accident. It was the Victorian way of controlling appearances, of wrapping chaos in lace and calling it order. Every object told the same story. That purity was impossible, but the illusion of purity had to be maintained at all costs. The bed frame looms above you now, carved with ornate detail, the weight of its presence as heavy as the grime that coats it. You imagine lying down, surrounded by arsenic pigments, breathing in coal fumes, lulled by the ticking of a clock that once belonged to a dead relative. The Victorian bedroom was never just about sleep. It was about managing fear, broadcasting morality, and concealing the very secrets that made the performance necessary in the first place. And as the lamp flickers, casting long shadows across the poisonous wallpaper, you realise the furniture itself was only half the secret. The real scandal lay in what these rooms were used for after the furniture was in place, when respectability gave way to desire. The practices that unfolded in the dark reveal even more about Victorian life than the arsenic on the walls ever could. The gaslight flickers lower, and the silence of the room becomes something heavier than comfort. For Victorians, this was the hour when private life turned into its most complicated performance. Publicly, the age was defined by restraint, morality, and a deep insistence on self-control. Privately, the bedroom was filled with contradictions, where desire was present but smothered under layers of guilt, medical warnings, and social expectation. If the furniture carried secrets of poison and dust, the people who inhabited these rooms carried secrets of their own, hidden in plain sight beneath the blankets. Marriage itself was supposed to be the safe and sanctioned outlet for intimacy. Yet even within that bond, everything was governed by manuals, doctors, and clergy, who insisted on rules for what should have been natural. Dozens of guides circulated under the guise of marriage instruction. Some were written with stern advice, reminding couples that relations should occur rarely, with procreation as the sole justification. Others were disguised as medical works, warning readers that too much indulgence could weaken the body, shorten life, or lead to moral corruption. Victorian couples read these lines by lamplight, perhaps nervously laughing, perhaps worrying that even their most private acts were under the surveillance of morality itself. One of the most infamous medical beliefs was that women were naturally passionless. Doctors and moralists insisted that female desire was either non-existent or dangerously abnormal. A respectable woman was meant to endure intimacy as a duty, not seek it for pleasure. Yet this did not match reality. Diaries, court records, and medical reports reveal women expressing frustration, curiosity, and sometimes outright rebellion against these expectations. The mismatch between what was preached and what was experienced created a private tension that lingered in bedrooms across the empire. Contraception existed, but in secret. Condoms, often called French letters or male sheaths, were made from animal intestines or treated linen. They were reused, expensive, and often smuggled discreetly. The Comstock laws and similar regulations in Britain made the sale of contraceptives illegal under obscenity statutes, but they circulated anyway in hidden markets. Withdrawal and rhythm methods were common but unreliable. Some women turned to pessaries or herbal remedies, which range from somewhat effective to dangerously toxic. The very fact that these methods existed in such variety is evidence that Victorians were far from chaste, even if society demanded that they pretend otherwise. The fear of disease haunted every encounter. Syphilis was rampant throughout the 19th century, earning nicknames like the pox or the Great Imitator for its wide range of symptoms. Soldiers brought it home from brothels, wealthy men spread it to wives who had no idea why they grew sick, and doctors struggled to treat it with mercury compounds that were nearly as deadly as the disease itself. Bedrooms were supposed to be sanctuaries, yet they often became battlegrounds against infections that carried both physical and social ruin. Respectability could be destroyed by something as invisible as a rash. Another peculiar Victorian preoccupation was hysteria, a diagnosis applied overwhelmingly to women who exhibited anxiety, fatigue, or sexual dissatisfaction. Doctors recommended treatments that sound absurd to modern ears. Some prescribed long rest cures, isolating women in their bedrooms with minimal stimulation, which often worsened their symptoms. Others used manual stimulation, performed in clinical settings, to bring about hysterical paroxysm, which was a carefully medicalized way of describing orgasm. These treatments were billed as respectable medicine, yet they reveal the hypocrisy of an age that condemned female pleasure while profiting from it in the doctor's office. Eventually, the vibrator was invented as a labour-saving device for physicians, marketed as a health instrument while conveniently ignoring its true function. Bedrooms also served as quiet sites of rebellion. While the drawing room displayed the Bible and the family portraits, nightstands often concealed items less suitable for guests. Erotic literature circulated underground, with works like Fanny Hill or translations of the Kama Sutra finding eager readers. Even among respectable households, couples sometimes possessed illustrated manuals disguised as anatomy texts. These books were hidden away behind piles of lace handkerchiefs or stuffed into locked drawers, waiting for the moment when curtains were drawn and morality could relax for a few hours. Privacy was a luxury not always afforded. In poorer homes, thin walls and shared spaces meant that intimacy was rarely discreet. Families living in one or two rooms often had to ignore what happened a few feet away, or pretend that sleep came quicker than it really did. Boarding houses sometimes placed unrelated adults in shared bedrooms, where whispered transactions or awkward arrangements blurred the line between necessity and desire. Respectability was a script followed by day, but in the cramped quarters of night it could not always be performed. The gender double standard ran deep. Men were quietly allowed to seek prostitutes, a practice so widespread that entire streets were known for it, while women were judged harshly for any hint of impropriety. Brothels flourished in cities like London, staffed not only by impoverished women but sometimes by those who'd been tricked or trafficked. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s targeted prostitutes for forced medical examinations, while their male clients faced no such scrutiny. The bedroom, whether in a brothel or a home, reflected a system where morality was enforced unevenly, punishing the vulnerable while excusing the powerful. As you glance around the room now, the contradictions pile up. A Bible sits proudly on the nightstand, beside a hidden packet of dubious French letters. A marriage manual scolds against indulgence, while under the bed a chamber pot gives off fumes that would ruin even the most romantic mood. a respectable woman lies swaddled in layers of linen, told she is passionless, while a doctor across town invents new contraptions to treat her supposed hysteria. The entire performance of morality cracks at the edges, revealing a society that was never as restrained as it claimed. And so the Victorian bedroom was not only a place of rest or design, but a theatre where desire was both staged and denied. Every object, from the curtains to the hidden pamphlets, told a story of contradiction. Respectability demanded silence, yet biology demanded otherwise. To live in that world was to constantly balance between the image presented to society and the reality that unfolded in the dark. The lamp burns lower, shadows stretch across the arsenic green wallpaper, and the bed frame groans under the weight of unspoken expectations. And as the air thickens with smoke, perfume, and secrecy, it becomes clear that the next set of secrets hiding in this room are not about intimacy at all. They are about the rituals of death that seeped into Victorian bedrooms, turning them into places where mourning and memory were as common as desire. The same bed that hosted restless sleep and awkward rituals of intimacy often became the final stage of life. Death did not happen quietly in hospitals as it does for many today. It happened in the bedroom, in the same space where families slept, dressed, prayed, and sometimes conceived their children. To die at home was not only common, it was expected. And so, every Victorian bedroom carried the silent weight of mortality alongside lace curtains and carved headboards. When illness struck, the bed transformed into a deathbed. Friends and family gathered around. Priests performed rites, and neighbours might be called in to witness the final hours. This was not seen as morbid, but as essential. To die surrounded by kin was considered a good death, proof that your life had been lived in order, and that you would be remembered. Children often watched these scenes, which meant the average Victorian grew up with an intimate familiarity with death that modern sensibilities might find unthinkable. For them, death was not an interruption of daily life, it was part of it. The body remained in the bedroom even after death. Refrigeration did not exist, so the deceased was laid out on the bed for a wake that could last several days. Curtains were drawn, mirrors were sometimes covered to prevent souls from becoming trapped, and clocks were stopped at the moment of passing. Visitors filed into the bedroom to pay respects, often in spaces that still smelled faintly of coal smoke, chamber pots, and unwashed linens. It was a setting that mixed grief with discomfort, making mourning a communal event layered over the private filth of everyday life. Victorians developed elaborate mourning customs that extended from the bedroom into every corner of life. Black crepe draped over doorways, mourning clothes worn for months or years, and entire industries devoted to producing jewellery made from the hair of the deceased. Hair was seen as incorruptible, a fragment of the body that survived long after burial, and so it was braided, woven, and set into lockets or rings. A woman might sleep each night beside a framed braid of her dead child's hair, a tangible reminder that the bedroom was as much a shrine as it was a sanctuary. These keepsakes were intimate, sometimes placed inside pillows or tucked into bedside drawers, blurring the line between comfort and obsession. Even furniture reflected mourning practices. Some beds were constructed with hidden compartments for storing relics of the dead, while wardrobes and dressers became places to keep mourning attire ready for sudden use. Death was so common that families often kept sets of mourning clothes on standby, knowing that they would be needed sooner rather than later. Entire wardrobes turned black at a moment's notice, as though grief was simply another layer of fabric to be put on and taken off. The obsession with death seeped into literature and art, which in turn shaped how people decorated their most private spaces. Bedroom walls sometimes bore prints of memorial poems or portraits of deceased relatives. Photographs of the dead, known as memento mori, were displayed on dressers. These images often showed the deceased posed as if still alive, sometimes seated in chairs or lying peacefully in bed. Families cherished these photographs, even sleeping within sight of them, a practice that today would strike many as unsettling, but which Victorians considered deeply comforting. Medical realities added another layer of strangeness. Without effective antibiotics, illnesses like tuberculosis lingered for months or years. Bedrooms became sick rooms where the sound of coughing echoed night after night, where handkerchiefs stained with blood piled up beside the washstand. Families lived in constant proximity to disease, and yet rarely considered moving patients to separate spaces. The idea of institutional care was associated with poverty or disgrace. To be tended at home, in your own bed, was a matter of dignity, even if it meant spreading infection to everyone else under the same roof. Wakes themselves could be strangely social. Visitors drank, ate, and sometimes even joked in the same room where the body lay. Children peeked at corpses, neighbours whispered, and the air thickened with the mingling smells of food and decay. Victorian culture balanced reverence with practicality. Death had to be honoured, but life had to continue, and the bedroom was the only stage large enough to hold both at once. Superstitions thrived in this environment. Families opened windows to let souls escape, placed coins on eyelids to keep them closed, and set flowers around the bed to mask odours. Some believed that mirrors should be shrouded to prevent spirits from being trapped inside. Others insisted on stopping clocks to prevent the household from being cursed. These practices mixed folk beliefs with Christian rites, producing a patchwork of ritual that was both solemn and faintly absurd. Imagine pausing between prayers to rearrange flowers in the hope that carnations might outwit tuberculosis. The commercialization of grief reached its peak in this period. Mourning became an industry, with companies producing everything from pre-made coffins to mourning stationery. Bedrooms filled with catalogues of funeral goods, black crepe samples, and advertisements for undertakers. Even patent medicines promised to ease grief-induced insomnia, encouraging the bereaved to consume opiates or tonics laced with alcohol. To mourn was not simply emotional, it was economic, and the bedroom was both marketplace and mausoleum. You can picture it now, the room heavy with velvet curtains, the bed draped in black cloth, a body lying beneath wreaths of flowers. The furniture groans under the weight of visitors, the mirror is hidden under a sheet, and the only sound is the shuffle of feet and the clink of cups as tea is served beside the corpse. This was not unusual. It was ordinary, a rhythm of life so constant that entire generations associated bedrooms not only with beginnings but with endings. And as you stand in that suffocating room, the mingling sense of roses, soot and decay rising in your nose, you begin to see how Victorian bedrooms were not just places of intimacy or secrecy, but of finality. They carried the weight of grief, transforming domestic spaces into temporary mortuaries, into stages where death and life shared the same script. But even in the midst of mourning, another set of secrets thrived within these rooms. Secrets that had nothing to do with funerals or family relics, but with what people read, whispered, and sometimes smuggled into their bedrooms when they thought no one was watching. The room that by day hosted mourning and prayer turned into something very different once the curtains were drawn. For Victorians, the bedroom was not just a place of sleep or intimacy. It was also a reading room, a private library where the public expectations of morality loosened just enough to allow hidden indulgences. Books, pamphlets, and papers crept into nightstands and under pillows, filling the silence with words that could not always be spoken aloud. The Bible remained the most common book by the bedside. Families treated it as both spiritual anchor and decorative object, its gilt pages resting proudly on dressers. Passages were read before sleep, prayers whispered, and children taught to recite verses under dim candlelight. But alongside those sacred words, another stream of literature flowed. Medical manuals written in dense language explained anatomy in terms that were supposed to be scientific, but often wandered close to the erotic. These guides promised to instruct couples on the duties of marriage, yet many readers discovered them to be more titillating than the authors likely intended. Erotic literature circulated widely despite censorship. Obscenity laws made its sale illegal, yet underground publishers thrived. Works like Fanny Hill, or translations of the Kama Sutra slipped into households, often disguised as serious studies of classical culture. Even poetry sometimes carried suggestive undertones, with volumes of Byron or Swinburne hidden behind respectable bindings. The sheer popularity of such works alarmed moral reformers who launched campaigns to purge them, but demand never slowed. Bedrooms across the empire became secret archives of material that respectable society insisted did not exist. Illustrated pamphlets, cheaply printed and distributed in hidden networks, offered another avenue of bedroom reading. These ranged from bawdy jokes to explicit imagery, sold quietly in urban markets or passed hand to hand. Police raids occasionally seized bundles of these pamphlets, but for every shipment destroyed, another emerged. Some were smuggled into Britain from France, a country already stereotyped as decadent, adding an extra layer of scandal. To be caught with one of these booklets was a risk, yet the temptation proved irresistible for many. The appetite for hidden reading extended even to what was marketed as health advice. Entire genres of pamphlets promised cures for private diseases, code for sexually transmitted infections. These advertisements, often filled with false promises, preyed on fear and shame. A man who contracted syphilis might secretly order a treatment by post, reading the instructions by candlelight while his family slept nearby. The bedroom became not only a site of indulgence but also of desperation, where the fear of exposure drove people into the arms of quack remedies that rarely worked. For women, the hidden library took other forms. Novels, often dismissed by critics as frivolous, were read with intensity. Stories of romance, passion, and forbidden encounters filled the hours between chores and sleep. Some reformers worried that novels corrupted women's morals, filling their heads with impossible desires. Yet the popularity of authors like Charlotte Bronte or George Eliot proved that women readers craved complexity, even if society wanted them to remain passive. In bedrooms across the country, novels became companions, offering escape from the suffocating rules of daily life. Anatomy texts and scientific treatises also found their way into bedrooms. The line between education and scandal was thin, and many readers opened these books with both curiosity and unease. Drawings of the human body, even when intended for medical instruction, carried a charge of forbidden knowledge. Some volumes were kept locked away, accessible only to men, reinforcing the belief that women should remain ignorant of their own bodies. Yet diaries and correspondence reveal that women did read them in secret, using their bedrooms as sanctuaries for learning what society denied them. The contradictions grew sharper as literacy rates rose. By the mid-19th century, more people than ever before could read, and cheap printing made books accessible. This expansion meant that scandalous works circulated more widely, often wrapped in plain covers to disguise their contents. The fear of discovery shaped the way Victorians interacted with their reading material. A respectable volume might sit in plain sight, while a risque one hid beneath a mattress waiting for a moment of privacy. Reading was not only indulgence, it was ritual. Candlelight strained the eyes, ink smudged fingers, and the smell of coal dust mixed with the faint tang of cheap paper. The bedroom filled with the sound of turning pages, a quiet rebellion against the silence demanded by society. Even respectable periodicals carried gossip columns and advice that hinted at scandal, offering readers a taste of the forbidden without crossing the line into outright obscenity. Publishers exploited this demand with double-layered texts. A book might be marketed as a travelogue or historical study, but contain passages that lingered on sensual detail. Readers understood the game. Respectable titles provided cover, while the real reason for purchase lay in the paragraphs that made the pulse quicken. In this way, the bedroom became the final stage of Victorian duplicity, a place where morality was displayed on the surface and curiosity thrived underneath. You can imagine the scene: a heavy Bible resting on the nightstand, its pages marked with careful ribbons. Beside it, tucked under a stack of handkerchiefs, a pamphlet on French hygiene that reads suspiciously like an erotic manual. A novel hidden beneath the pillow, its heroine caught between duty and passion. The lamplight flickers, casting shadows across arsenic wallpaper, while the reader leans closer, heart racing at the possibility of being discovered. Respectability is preserved, yet secrecy breathes just as loudly in the same room. And as the last page turns, the candle sputters, filling the air with a thin trail of smoke. The book is hidden, the Bible placed on top, and the performance of morality resumes. Yet the knowledge lingers, the images remain, and the bedroom carries another layer of secrets beneath its polished veneer. But the hidden words were only one part of the story. The air itself carried secrets of a different kind, not printed on paper, but woven into fabric and breathed through lungs. Because Victorian bedrooms were not only libraries of morality and scandal, they were laboratories of disease, where germs thrived long before anyone could name them. The walls may have been covered in lace and floral wallpaper, but they hid a truth no amount of ornament could disguise. Victorian bedrooms were petri dishes before germ theory had a name. Long before Pasteur proved that invisible organisms caused disease, the reigning explanation was miasma. Foul air, thought to rise from filth and stagnant spaces, was blamed for everything from cholera to insomnia, which meant that the very atmosphere of the bedroom was seen as both protective and poisonous. Curtains were drawn tight to keep out night air, but those same curtains trapped every cough, sneeze and whiff of coal smoke inside. A Victorian bedroom was less a refuge and more a low-budget gas chamber with fancy drapery. Tuberculosis was the spectre haunting nearly every household. Known as consumption, it was slow, relentless, and terrifying. Bedrooms turned into sick rooms where patients coughed blood into handkerchiefs, their weight dropping until skin clung to bone. Doctors prescribed fresh air and rest, which might have helped, but families instead locked windows and pulled blankets higher. The illness spread easily in cramped quarters, travelling through droplets long before anyone knew how. Entire households watched relatives wither in the same beds that others had to keep sleeping in. The disease was so common that poets romanticised it, turning pale faces and hacking coughs into symbols of tragic beauty. In reality, the sound of someone coughing all night while you tried to sleep was less romantic and more horrifying. Linen became another silent accomplice. Sheets, rarely washed, absorbed sweat and spit from the ill. Washing day was a monumental effort, so fabric carried germs from one month to the next. Families sometimes inherited bedding from deceased relatives, unknowingly passing on more than just heirlooms. Quilts stitched from scraps of clothing might include fabric that once belonged to the sick, turning comfort into contagion. Even pillows held danger. Stuffed with feathers or horsehair, they became reservoirs of bacteria, pressed against mouths night after night. The bed was not a place of recovery, but of incubation. Patent medicines thrived on this fear. Bottles lined bedroom shelves, promising relief from coughs, sleeplessness, or general malaise. Laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, was prescribed for nearly everything. Mothers gave it to restless children, insomniacs took it by the spoonful, and consumptives used it to ease their coughing fits. It dulled pain but created widespread addiction. Another favourite was chlorodyne, laced with chloroform and morphine, which did wonders for coughs, but left users groggy and dependent. Bedrooms became pharmacies where sleep was induced not by peace, but by narcotics that blurred the line between rest and stupor. Superstitions about air added another layer of absurdity. Night air was considered dangerous, believed to carry invisible poisons that weakened the lungs. Windows were nailed shut, curtains drawn tight, and cracks stuffed with rags to prevent a single draught from sneaking in. Families congratulated themselves on keeping the sickness out, unaware that they were trapping every germ inside with them. Those who dared to open windows were sometimes mocked as reckless, as though a breath of fresh air were more dangerous than sharing a bed with a consumptive relative. In this way, the fear of imaginary poisons made the real ones stronger. Other illnesses thrived in these closed spaces. Typhus, scarlet fever, and diphtheria swept through households, turning bedrooms into quarantine wards. Without antibiotics, recovery relied on fresh bedding, ventilation, and rest, but the average family lacked all three. Doctors sometimes recommended moving the sick to different rooms, but few homes had the space. Instead, entire families slept together in the same infested air, hoping for divine mercy. Clergymen prayed beside beds, servants carried out basins of bloody water, and all the while the disease lingered in every fabric fold. Cleanliness rituals tried to fill the gap, but they were often more symbolic than effective. Some families burned vinegar in basins to cleanse the air, leaving behind a sour stench rather than any real protection. Others placed herbs like lavender or rosemary under pillows, hoping the scent would purify sickness. Camphor balls were hung in small pouches around necks, swinging like talismans against invisible foes. These efforts may have offered comfort, but they did little to slow the march of disease. Bedrooms remained battlegrounds where science lagged behind superstition, and where comfort came more from ritual than from results. Even architecture contributed to illness. Bedrooms were often built small to conserve heat, with low ceilings and narrow windows. In city slums, entire families crammed into single rooms, the air thick with smoke from shared stoves. Wealthier homes were no safer, as ornate drapery and layered carpets collected dust and damp. Houses near factories or coal yards drew in polluted air even when windows were shut. The very design of the bedroom created environments where bacteria flourished, hiding behind wallpaper and in folds of fabric. You picture it now, the gas lamp flickering, the air stale, the cough of a relative echoing through the room, sheets clinging with sweat, pillows damp, and a mother spooning laudanum into a child's mouth to quiet the night. On the dresser, a Bible sits beside a bottle of chlorodyne, one promising spiritual relief, the other chemical. Both are symbols of the same desperation. In the Victorian bedroom, the battle between health and disease was constant, and the odds were rarely in favour of survival. And just as illness shaped the air, it also shaped the objects families kept around them. Not just medicines and talismans, but entire industries of bedroom gadgets designed to protect or soothe. Some were well-meaning, others outright fraudulent, and many bordered on comedy. The next layer of secrets lies in those inventions, the contraptions Victorians dragged into their bedrooms in the hope of finding peace where none existed. The objects that filled Victorian bedrooms were not limited to beds, curtains and wallpaper. A whole economy flourished around the promise of better rest, better morals and better health, and it produced some of the strangest contraptions ever dragged into a private room. The Victorian bedroom was as much a laboratory as it was a sanctuary, crammed with devices that claimed to cure ailments, discipline the body, or defend against invisible dangers. Some were ingenious, many were ridiculous, and nearly all carried risks that outweighed their supposed benefits. Invalid beds became a common sight in homes where long-term illness was present. These were adjustable contraptions of wood and iron that allowed patients to be propped up, rolled over, or shifted with levers. Advertised as humane aids, they were often unwieldy and creaked like torture devices. Wealthy families could purchase elaborate models with wheels and pulleys, while poorer households made do with rougher versions cobbled together by carpenters. The intention was to ease suffering, but many looked less like beds and more like siege engines parked in the middle of a bedroom. Ventilation devices also promised salvation. Since miasma theory blamed foul air for disease, inventors rushed to create contraptions to cleanse it. Mechanical air pumps, rotating fans, and perforated tin boxes stuffed with herbs were installed near beds. Some households burned vinegar or camphor in specially designed holders that looked like miniature braziers. Advertisements promised pure air, but the results were more smoke than science. The irony was inescapable. Families terrified of drafts spent money on machines to stir the very air they refused to let in through windows. Then came the gadgets designed to enforce morality. Bed cradles, wooden or metal frames, were placed over blankets to prevent the covers from touching the body too closely. The reasoning was that heavy blankets encouraged immoral behaviour at night. Some parents even fitted children's beds with restraining sheets or gloves that tied hands above the covers. These contraptions were marketed as tools of discipline, yet they reveal how paranoia about desire shaped even the furniture of private life. A child who tossed restlessly in bed might find themselves strapped like a patient in an asylum, all in the name of protecting virtue. Quack devices thrived in this environment. The patent medicine industry was matched by the patent gadget industry, which flooded bedrooms with bizarre instruments. One popular category was galvanic belts and electric pillows. These claimed to channel gentle currents of electricity through the body, restoring vigour, curing insomnia, and banishing weakness. In reality, they delivered either nothing at all or painful jolts from crude batteries. Yet advertisements showed beaming couples crediting their restful nights to a pillow that was essentially a poorly wired hazard. Some belts were marketed specifically to men with promises of restoring masculinity, making them an early ancestor of late-night infomercial scams. Heating devices filled another niche. Before central heating, keeping warm was a nightly struggle. Some bedrooms featured hot water bottles made of metal or ceramic, slipped under the covers before bed. Others turned to bed warmers, pans filled with hot coals and shoved between sheets. The latter carried obvious risks, as smouldering embers sometimes set linens ablaze. Newspapers record tragic fires that began with attempts to keep toes warm. To fall asleep in a Victorian bed was to gamble not only with fleas and fumes, but with the possibility that your blanket might ignite before morning. Medical gadgets multiplied in alarming numbers. Inhalers for asthma, often nothing more than tubes filled with herbs or chemicals, were clutched by bedside tables. Massage rollers promised to stimulate circulation while you lay in bed, some fitted with spikes or brushes that would not look out of place in a torture chamber. There were even contraptions called respirators, gauze masks meant to purify the air of coal smoke and miasma. Users tied them over their mouths at night, resembling sleepwalkers in costume, only to wake with damp cloths caked in soot. Even clocks became part of the bedroom arsenal. Alarm clocks grew more elaborate with designs that sprayed water, rang bells, or shook the bed itself. One notorious design dropped marbles into a metal tray until the clatter drove sleepers upright. Another used spring-loaded mechanisms to tilt the mattress, unceremoniously dumping its occupant onto the floor. These were marketed as aids to discipline and punctuality, reflecting a culture obsessed with productivity even in private life. To oversleep was not laziness but moral failure, and so the Victorian bedroom filled with machines designed to terrify people into rising. The culture of invention blurred easily into fraud. Advertisements promised miracle cures, often accompanied by glowing testimonials from supposed doctors. Families desperate for relief spent precious savings on devices that offered little beyond novelty. The boundary between genuine innovation and outright scam was thin, and bedrooms became testing grounds for both. Every gadget carried the same message, that comfort, health, and morality could be engineered if only you bought the right contraption. Picture it now, a bedroom cluttered not just with furniture but with gadgets humming, ticking, or smouldering in the dark. A patient propped up in an invalid bed that looks like a catapult. A galvanic belt crackling faintly on the dresser. A bed cradle hovering above the blankets like a skeletal frame. A pan of glowing coals slipping dangerously toward the edge of the mattress. And on the wall, a clock preparing to hurl its owner to the floor at dawn. This was not just a room. It was a stage for invention, paranoia, and commerce, all wrapped in lace. And yet, even with all these devices promising order and safety, the reality of the bedroom was still chaos. Gadgets could not change the fact that families lived in constant contact, that privacy was rare, and that secrets spilled out as easily as smoke from a gas lamp. Which leads to the next layer of truth, one that no contraption could prevent. The people who inhabited these bedrooms were rarely alone. Servants, relatives, and sometimes strangers shared the same spaces. turning privacy itself into one of the greatest illusions of the Victorian home. Privacy in the Victorian bedroom was less a right and more a fantasy, carefully staged but rarely lived. The idea of the bedroom as a private sanctuary belonged mostly to novels and etiquette manuals. In practice, few Victorians could ever shut a door and be truly alone. Bedrooms were porous, invaded by servants, relatives, and sometimes complete strangers who drifted through houses, boarding rooms, and city lodging quarters. The notion of solitude was as decorative as the lace curtains. For the wealthy, privacy was undermined by servants. Every morning began with chambermaids entering to empty chamber pots, strip beds, or light fires. Footmen delivered hot water for washing. Ladies' maids laid out clothing, adjusted corsets, and even brushed hair at bedside. A gentleman's valet hovered nearby, polishing boots or arranging a cravat. These roles were expected, but they meant that one's most intimate space was constantly shared with others. Servants moved quietly, but their presence was inescapable. Your secrets, whether a half-hidden pamphlet or a bottle of patent medicine, were never entirely your own. In households where dozens of staff bustled about, bedrooms were not sealed retreats but stages where social hierarchy played itself out from the moment the door opened. For the middle class, the invasion of privacy took different forms. Families often shared bedrooms to save space. Siblings slept in narrow beds, sometimes 3 to a mattress. Visiting relatives were tucked into corners or pressed into already crowded quarters. Boarding lodgers might even be offered a space in the master bedroom if every other room was full. Etiquette advised separating sexes, but poverty ignored etiquette. Privacy meant pulling the covers tighter and pretending to sleep while everyone else went about their business only feet away. In poorer districts, entire families crammed into single rooms that doubled as kitchen, workshop, and bedroom. Tenement housing in cities like London or Manchester saw families of 6 or 7 packed into spaces smaller than modern closets. Curtains might divide areas into makeshift sleeping compartments, but noise and smell seeped through everything. Overcrowding was so extreme that inspectors recorded multiple families renting space in the same room, with one family occupying the beds during the day and another at night. In such conditions, the concept of a private bedroom was absurd. The walls themselves were too thin, the space too small, and the lives too entangled. Boarding houses created another peculiar layer. Travellers, workers, and the newly urbanised often found themselves renting beds rather than rooms. It was common to share a mattress with a stranger, each person occupying half the bed and pretending not to notice. Some establishments offered shifts, where one person slept while another worked, trading places every 12 hours. The practice was called hot bedding, since the sheets never cooled between occupants. It was economical but also ripe for scandal, as newspapers printed stories of inappropriate encounters in lodging houses that doubled as brothels. To climb into a bed still warm from the last body was considered normal, not shocking, even if it blurred every boundary of privacy. Even architecture betrayed the illusion of solitude. Many houses lacked interior locks, bedrooms opened directly into hallways, and doors were expected to remain unbolted for access by family or servants. Locked doors suggested secrecy or impropriety, which carried its own dangers. Better to leave your door accessible than risk being accused of hiding something. Yet this left even the wealthy with no real control over who entered or when. A late-night intrusion by a servant with firewood or a curious sibling was not unusual. The culture of surveillance extended beyond architecture. Parents monitored children's sleep, checking hands above covers to ensure moral purity. Boarding schools enforced shared dormitories, where dozens of boys or girls slept side by side under watchful eyes. Respectability required observation. Bedrooms were not safe havens, but moral training grounds where behaviour was constantly policed. Even in marriage, privacy was compromised. Twin beds, fashionable among the middle class, suggested propriety, but often masked visits across the room during the night. The very furniture carried messages about who was watching and what they might think. Servants themselves faced the worst erosion of privacy. Many slept in cramped attic rooms, basements, or even in closets near the bedrooms of their employers. Maids might be summoned at all hours, forced to sleep lightly in case a bell rang. Beds were narrow, mattresses thin, and walls papered with scraps to block drafts. Privacy for servants did not exist at all, as employers reserved the right to enter their rooms whenever they pleased. Bedrooms for staff were not sanctuaries but extensions of labour, constant reminders of their status within the household. Privacy was also compromised by sound. Thin walls and creaking floorboards carried whispers, sighs and arguments through houses. Families often knew more about each other's nocturnal habits than they admitted. Servants overheard conversations meant to be private. Boarding house neighbours listened to everything whether they wanted to or not. The bedroom might hold secrets, but those secrets were rarely contained within four walls. They leaked through architecture, gossip, and the constant hum of communal living. You can imagine the scene now. A master bedroom dressed in velvet and lace, yet 3 servants slip in before dawn to stir the fire. A tenement room where a family of 7 sleeps in shifts, blankets still damp from the previous occupant. A boarding house where strangers roll into the same mattress without introduction. Privacy, so carefully portrayed in etiquette manuals and novels, was nothing more than an illusion staged for respectability. And as the door swings open yet again, another servant crossing the threshold without knocking, it becomes clear that secrecy had to be hidden more carefully. If a Victorian wanted to conceal something truly private, it could not be left in a nightstand or under a pillow. It had to be hidden in ways that fooled both the eye and the ear. Which brings us to the next set of secrets. Not about who entered the bedroom, but about what people hid inside it. False drawers, secret compartments, and ingenious hiding places reveal how far Victorians went to guard the truths they could never admit aloud. The more crowded the bedroom became with servants, family members, and even strangers passing through, the more essential it became to hide what truly mattered. Victorian bedrooms doubled as vaults of secrecy, filled with clever hiding places designed to keep out both prying eyes and accidental discoveries. Respectability was a performance, but secrecy was survival, and furniture makers catered to this need with ingenuity that blurred the line between craftsmanship and espionage. Wardrobes often contained false panels. Behind neat rows of folded clothing lay narrow cavities where letters, pamphlets, or jewellery could be stashed. These compartments were invisible to a casual glance but obvious to their owners, who slid panels aside with a practiced touch. Dressers featured false bottoms, drawers that appeared shallow but concealed extra inches of space beneath. These became the perfect place for hiding love letters, contraceptives, or contraband literature. In a society where discovery could ruin reputations, the ability to make a drawer appear empty while concealing its most valuable contents was as essential as the lace draped on the bed. Writing desks, often kept in bedrooms, held even more elaborate tricks. Secret cubbies clicked open with hidden latches, releasing small compartments for storing correspondence. Locks were common, but they were rarely foolproof. Servants had access to keys, and locksmiths could be bribed. So furniture makers built desks with false fronts and nested spaces, ensuring that even if someone pried open the obvious compartments, the true secrets remained hidden deeper within. A respectable Victorian might sit at such a desk in the evening, writing pious letters to relatives, while knowing that beneath the pen lay drawers filled with material that would scandalise their entire family. Books themselves became hiding places. Hollowed-out Bibles or dictionaries were not uncommon, allowing forbidden pamphlets to masquerade as respectable reading material. Erotic novels, banned by law but still circulating, could be disguised inside the covers of harmless sermons. Even small bottles of patent medicines, sometimes used for far more than their intended purposes, could be tucked inside hollowed books. Imagine a nightstand stacked with volumes of theology, each one buzzing with secrets carved neatly into their spines. Lockable boxes were another staple of the Victorian bedroom. Some were disguised as simple jewellery caskets, others as sewing kits or writing cases. These boxes often contained hair keepsakes, love tokens, or even money hidden from spouses. In some cases, they held items that blurred lines between medicine and desire, like early vibrators marketed as health devices. Advertisements never admitted their true use, but their presence in locked bedroom boxes said more than any pamphlet could. Servants tasked with dusting such boxes might never know the contents, but they understood perfectly well that what was locked was not meant to be discussed. Religious artifacts provided another kind of cover. Crosses with hollow backs, rosaries with hidden compartments, and small reliquaries sometimes doubled as secret storage. Faith and secrecy intertwined, allowing people to keep personal items close under the guise of devotion. Even within devout households, these objects often held less than saintly contents. A rosary case might conceal coins, jewellery, or folded paper notes not meant for outside eyes. The very tools of piety became tools of discretion. Men and women alike used clothing to conceal private belongings. Corsets could hide small packets of money or folded notes, slipped between fabric and body. Waistcoats included secret pockets designed for watches or coins, but sometimes also for illicit tokens. Bedrooms became sites where these garments were not only donned but also carefully unpacked, revealing or concealing their hidden cargo. In households where even locked drawers might be opened by others, the body itself became the last vault. Letters posed perhaps the greatest risk of discovery. Courting couples, clandestine lovers, and even ordinary spouses left behind trails of ink that could betray them. To guard against exposure, many hid correspondence in unlikely places. Mattresses were slashed open at seams and resewn after notes were tucked inside. Curtain hems were stitched with folded papers, invisible unless the fabric was carefully examined. Carpets concealed letters pressed beneath floorboards. Bedrooms, with their heavy fabrics and endless seams, offered more hiding spaces than any other room in the house. Each fold of lace or panel of wood might hold a secret that could destroy reputations if exposed. The obsession with secrecy was not limited to love affairs. Political pamphlets, banned books, or radical tracts circulated through hidden bedroom compartments. During periods of unrest, even the possession of certain works was dangerous. Bedrooms doubled as archives of dissent, their secrets stitched into quilts or tucked behind headboards. To outsiders, the room appeared as a shrine of morality. In truth, it might conceal the literature of revolution beneath layers of embroidered fabric. And then there were the objects that could never be admitted to openly. Contraceptives, erotic illustrations, patent devices marketed for health, all hidden in false drawers and hollowed books. Discovery meant scandal, so secrecy was not optional, but essential. The ingenuity of Victorian hiding places reveals how much people feared exposure, and how determined they were to preserve the illusion of purity while indulging in the realities of human life. Picture it clearly. A wardrobe heavy with velvet skirts, behind which a false panel hides a packet of letters bound with ribbon. A desk with secret compartments, one holding a locket of hair, another an illustrated pamphlet from Paris. A hollow Bible resting on a nightstand, its pages concealing a small bottle of laudanum. The furniture itself groans with duplicity, every drawer a stage where morality and secrecy collide. And as you glance around the room, realizing that every object might hold a second identity, it becomes clear that the secrets of Victorian bedrooms were not just hidden in furniture. They were written across bodies too. From corsets reshaping the female form to trousers concealing hidden compartments, clothing itself was as deceptive as the furniture it hung upon. The next layer of secrets lies not in what Victorians placed inside their bedrooms, but in what they wore to bed and how those garments revealed more than they concealed. The secrets of the bedroom were not only hidden in furniture or tucked away in drawers, they were stitched directly into the garments people wore each night. To step into a Victorian bedroom was to enter a fashion show of fabric layers that covered, constricted, and sometimes concealed far more than they revealed. Sleepwear was never only about comfort, it was about morality, symbolism, and the unending obsession with appearances. Even in the dark, Victorians could not escape the weight of fabric dictating who they were supposed to be. Nightgowns were the most visible emblem of this obsession. Women were swaddled in yards of linen or cotton, garments that reached from neck to ankle, buttoned high and stitched thick enough to defeat even the most determined draft. Lace collars, ruffled cuffs, and tiny pearl buttons turned these gowns into statements of respectability, as though a person needed to maintain decency while unconscious. For wealthier women, the fabric was fine lawn, or even silk, trimmed with embroidery that whispered refinement. For the poor, it was coarse cotton that scratched the skin, worn so long that stains became permanent patterns. Either way, the effect was the same. The body beneath was hidden, erased beneath folds of cloth that denied shape or form. Men fared little better. The male nightshirt looked suspiciously like an oversized dress, falling mid-calf and often decorated with collars or plackets that made its wearer resemble an accountant who had given up halfway through dressing. Illustrations from the period show men in these garments holding candles, faces stern, the effect more comical than dignified. They were practical in the sense that they covered the body and allowed movement, but they also reinforced the idea that even in bed a man was meant to appear controlled. The thought of sleeping in nothing at all, though not unheard of, was considered scandalous. Nudity in a Victorian bedroom was rarely about comfort. It was about shame. Corsets played their own role in these nighttime rituals. Medical authorities warned against sleeping in them, claiming they compressed organs and damaged health. Yet many women kept them on, or loosened rather than removed them entirely, unwilling to risk being seen out of shape even for a few hours. Corsets became symbols of both endurance and fear. They shaped the body during the day and haunted it at night, reminders that appearance was a 24-hour performance. Diaries reveal women writing of discomfort, of the difficulty of lying flat with stays pressing into ribs, yet the pressure of respectability often outweighed the lure of comfort. Children were not spared from the tyranny of nightwear. Manuals advised mothers to ensure children were tightly wrapped at night to prevent immoral habits. Hands were sometimes bound in mitts, blankets tucked and tied to restrain movement, and garments fastened with rows of buttons designed to frustrate any attempts at freedom. The fear of nocturnal sin ran so deep that even infants were swaddled with moral undertones, as though a baby could compromise the household reputation from its cradle. Bedrooms were training grounds, and clothing was the first line of discipline. The materials themselves told stories about class and commerce. Cotton became widespread in the 19th century thanks to industrial spinning and colonial trade, making it affordable for working families. Yet its affordability came at a cost of durability. Cheaper garments wore thin quickly, patched and mended until they resembled quilts more than clothes. Wealthier households indulged in silks or fine muslins, fragile but luxurious, often imported from abroad. These fabrics signalled refinement even in sleep, proof that a person's status extended to the unseen hours of night. The global economy was stitched into every seam, with Indian cotton, Chinese silk, and European lace converging in one suffocating nightgown. Laundry added another layer of difficulty. Washing delicate fabrics was labour-intensive, so garments often went unwashed for weeks. Sweat, soot, and coal smoke clung to the fibres, leaving faint halos under arms and collars. Servants scrubbed with harsh soaps that weakened threads, so wealthier families often maintained wardrobes of multiple gowns and shirts to rotate between washes. Poorer households had no such luxury. Nightwear was worn until it practically walked on its own. To climb into bed was to slip into a garment that carried the memory of weeks of use, its fabric stiff with starch or sagging with grime. Fashion manuals occasionally advised on proper attire for bed, warning against garments that were too warm or too restrictive. Yet the advice was often ignored. In cold climates, multiple layers were added, sometimes so many that movement was nearly impossible. In summer, heavy fabric still prevailed because modesty outweighed comfort. The sight of a bare arm or leg, even in private, was treated as improper. Bedrooms became theatres of restraint, where even unconscious bodies were expected to perform decency. Symbolism shaped the garments as much as fabric. White nightgowns carried associations of purity, innocence, and spiritual cleanliness. To sleep in white was to reinforce moral standing, even as the garment absorbed sweat and dirt by morning. Darker fabrics were less common, though they did appear in mourning households where grief permeated every detail. Even in sleep, Victorians wore their sorrows on their sleeves, literally cloaked in black cotton as they lay in mourning beds. Despite the emphasis on covering the body, there were always those who resisted. Some accounts describe men discarding nightshirts during heat waves, or women loosening garments in secret for comfort. Travellers in rural areas often remarked that peasants slept in little more than undergarments, a practical choice that shocked outsiders. These glimpses reveal the limits of fashion, showing that beneath the moral codes, ordinary people sometimes chose comfort over conformity. Yet such admissions rarely made it into print, and when they did, they were framed as scandal. You picture the room now, a woman sinking beneath a heavy white nightgown, her breath shallow beneath the weight of lace, a man fumbling with the buttons of a calf-length nightshirt, candles sputtering as he finally collapses into bed. Children wrapped like parcels, hands bound in mitts, eyes wide in the darkness. The garments rustle with every movement, whispering reminders that even here, in the supposed privacy of the bedroom, there is no escape from expectation. And as the room falls silent, fabric stiff and suffocating, it becomes clear that the secrets of the Victorian bedroom were not only about what was hidden in drawers or closets, they were written across every button and seam, woven into the very clothes worn to sleep. But garments could only cover so much. The body beneath told its own story, marked by illnesses, scars, and unspoken realities. And the next layer of secrets lay in how Victorians treated those bodies in their most vulnerable moments, when sleep blurred into sickness, and care became both intimate and invasive. The same bedroom that suffocated under lace curtains and layers of nightgowns often transformed into a sick room. When illness struck, there were no hospitals for most families to send patients to, no clean wards or sterile beds. The care happened at home, and the burden fell squarely onto the bedroom. The space became both hospital and hospice, crowded with bottles, bowls, and the heavy breath of the sick. Nursing was not a profession for most. It was the duty of family members, usually women, who tended the ill with whatever knowledge or superstition they possessed. A daughter or wife might sit at the edge of a bed, sponging a feverish forehead with vinegar water or spooning broth between dry lips. Advice came from neighbours, magazines, or the booming trade in self-help medical guides. Every bedroom became a theatre of guesswork, where one hand reached for prayer books and the other for patent medicine. Patent medicine bottles lined bedside tables like soldiers, promising relief from ailments they could never truly cure. There was Godfrey's cordial, a mixture of opium and treacle given even to infants to keep them quiet. There was chlorodyne with chloroform and morphine, marketed as a cure for coughs, headaches, and insomnia. There was laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, prescribed for everything from toothache to grief. Families trusted these concoctions, ignoring or unaware of their addictive dangers. Bedrooms became places where the line between treatment and sedation blurred, with entire households quietly addicted under the guise of care. Food was another supposed cure. Beef tea, essentially broth simmered from bones, was prescribed for nearly everything. Invalid cookbooks offered endless variations of arrowroot puddings, barley water, and milk possets. The sick might be fed through long nights, even as they coughed too much to keep food down. Doctors swore by these diets, believing that light nourishment kept the body balanced. In truth, many patients starved slowly, spoon by spoon, as families clung to the ritual of feeding as though it could fend off death. The sick room smelled as much as it sounded. Damp towels hung over chairs, bowls of used water stood forgotten, chamber pots overflowed beneath the bed. The air was thick with vinegar, camphor and sweat. Coal fires burned to keep patients warm, filling lungs with smoke that worsened coughs. Yet ventilation was avoided, for fear of night air. Curtains were drawn, sealing in fumes, until the bedroom resembled more a chemical chamber than a refuge. Visitors stepped in and recoiled, but families accepted it as part of the fight. Nursing practices varied wildly between households. Some mothers wrapped fevers in cold sheets, believing shock would break the heat. Others buried patients beneath piles of blankets until they nearly suffocated. Alcohol was poured freely as both disinfectant and medicine. Brandy soothed nerves, gin calmed stomachs, and whiskey warmed the dying. A patient might drift in and out of fever dreams, while relatives argued whether to add more blankets or more brandy. In the absence of medical consensus, bedrooms became laboratories of contradiction. Even posture was prescribed. Invalid beds were propped with pillows, ropes rigged from ceilings to help patients sit up, and trays fitted across laps to encourage eating. Some bedrooms featured wheeled chairs or cradles to shift sufferers between bed and window. Doctors believed fresh air might help consumptives, but families compromised by pushing beds near closed panes, letting the patient gaze out at air they were forbidden to breathe. These contraptions cluttered rooms already burdened by furniture, leaving little space to walk without tripping over another instrument of care. The sick were rarely left alone. Families believed constant watchfulness was part of treatment. Children crept into rooms to stare at pale faces. Neighbours stopped by to offer remedies. Clergymen hovered with prayer books. The line between visitation and intrusion blurred. Privacy was surrendered, the patient becoming an object of communal duty. Even in their most vulnerable hours, Victorians were surrounded, watched and managed, as though solitude itself was too dangerous to allow. Illness also carried moral weight. Sickness was interpreted as a test of character or punishment for sin. Families measured patience, resignation, and piety as carefully as pulse and temperature. To complain too loudly was to risk being seen as spiritually weak. To endure quietly was to embody Victorian virtue. The bedroom became a stage not only for physical struggle, but for moral performance, where even the act of suffering had to align with societal expectations. The presence of death was never far. Many who entered the sick room never left it. Children wasted away from scarlet fever. Parents coughed themselves thin with tuberculosis, and the elderly simply faded. The bed that served as sickbed often became deathbed, with only a shift of sheets marking the transition. Families continued tending, feeding, praying, even when hope was gone, unwilling to abandon rituals that had become routine. The bedroom swallowed both life and death without pause. You can see the room in your mind. A bed tilted with pillows, a pale figure propped upright, a nightstand cluttered with medicine bottles, spoons sticky with syrup, and a damp towel folded neatly but reeking of vinegar. A fire smouldering, smoke curling through curtains drawn too tightly. A family member asleep in a chair, waking every few minutes to check a pulse. The air so heavy with fumes and sweat that even the healthy would struggle to breathe. This was not an emergency space prepared for rare crises. It was the ordinary bedroom, repurposed yet again to meet the unending demands of daily life. And as the night drags on, punctuated by coughs and murmurs, you realise that Victorian bedrooms were never only about sleep. They were places where bodies were managed, propped, dosed, and judged. Where illness revealed as much about society as about health. But care was only one side of the story. The other side was what happened when that care was not enough, when death arrived and families were left to decide what to do next. When the sick room failed in its purpose and breath finally stilled, the bedroom did not rest. It simply changed roles. The same bed that hosted fever and delirium became the deathbed, and the body remained there, laid out in dignity or discomfort, for days. Hospitals and funeral parlours were rare for most classes, so the bedroom became the first stage of mourning. Families knew the routines well, for death was never a stranger in the Victorian household. Preparing the body was a domestic duty. often done by women in the family or a local midwife who doubled as undertaker. The corpse was washed with water scented by vinegar, lavender or camphor to disguise the inevitable odours. Eyes were closed with coins or small weights, mouths tied shut with strips of cloth, and the body straightened before rigor mortis locked it into place. Clean night clothes were dressed onto the body, for presentation mattered even in death. It was not only a ritual of hygiene, but also of respect, for appearances continued to carry moral weight beyond the grave. The room was rearranged to suit the dead. Windows were cracked slightly to let the soul escape, curtains drawn to dim the light, mirrors draped in cloth to prevent the spirit from being trapped or startling a visitor. A sheet was spread neatly over the body, sometimes pinned with flowers to mask the smell. In wealthier homes, black drapes might be hung around the bed to create a solemn backdrop. In poorer households, even a simple blanket or shawl served the same symbolic role. Death was given a stage, and the bedroom the theatre in which grief unfolded. Visitors came quickly. Neighbours and relatives crowded into the space, filing past the bed to pay respects. The Victorian bedroom was not a private place in this moment, but a public chamber of mourning, open to anyone with a connection to the family. Children peered in curiously, adults whispered, and the scent of flowers mingled with the less delicate reality of decomposition. With no refrigeration, time was limited, and the pressure to display dignity before decay took over was immense. Mourning objects made their appearance in the bedroom. Clocks were stopped at the moment of death. Photographers arrived, carrying heavy equipment to capture post-mortem portraits that would serve as the only likeness for many families. The body might be propped in bed, seated in a chair, or even posed with siblings for one final family picture. The practice strikes modern viewers as macabre, but in an age before affordable photography, it was an act of remembrance. The dead did not leave without being fixed in image, their faces framed in albums beside the living. Hair jewellery was another custom born from the bedroom. Locks were snipped from the deceased, woven into rings, brooches, or braided into intricate patterns beneath glass. These keepsakes were often cut discreetly during the final preparations, tucked away as the corpse lay in bed. To wear the hair of the departed was not seen as unsettling but as deeply sentimental, a physical link that could be carried through daily life. The bedroom thus became not only the place of loss, but the source of personal relics that endured long after. Smells presented the greatest challenge. Without embalming for most households, decomposition advanced rapidly, especially in summer. Families relied on flowers, herbs, and open windows to mask odours. Roses, lilies, and violets were stuffed into vases and tucked into sheets. Stronger options like rosemary and camphor were scattered about, their sharp scents battling the inevitable. It was a losing war, but Victorians persisted, turning the bedroom into a mix of sickly sweetness and bitter disinfectant, a fragrance forever tied to grief. The rituals extended to sound. Hymns were sung around the bed, prayers recited, and clocks ticking in the background provided an unnerving rhythm. Silence was rarely absolute, for visitors came and went, neighbours brought food and carriages rattled outside. Yet in the quiet moments, the house seemed to tilt around the stillness of that one figure in the bed, the centre of attention even in absence of life. For Victorians, the presence of the dead was not to be rushed away but acknowledged, observed, and lingered with until burial called. Death in the bedroom also shaped clothing outside of it. Widows and daughters were expected to don black, sometimes for years, and mourning dress was a booming business. Shops sold entire wardrobes of black crepe, veils, and gloves, feeding an economy built on grief. These outfits often had their origin in the bedroom, chosen beside the corpse itself, as families scrambled to meet the expectations of mourning etiquette. Even in their most intimate space, they were reminded that death was not only personal but social, with reputations measured in fabric and colour. One of the strangest parts of Victorian death culture was the blending of fear and fascination. While some believed that lingering too near the body invited illness or bad luck, others treated the corpse almost as a guest. Children kissed cold cheeks, adults touched hands, and friends lingered in the room speaking softly as though the dead could hear. The line between living and dead was blurred, the bedroom bridging the two worlds. To modern eyes it seems morbid, but to Victorians it was intimacy, proof of care even in the final moments of farewell. If illness had made the bedroom a place of suffering, death made it a museum of memory. Every object carried meaning, from the sheets covering the body to the flowers wilting beside it. The room held the weight of both absence and presence, its furniture reshaped to serve rituals that were as much about comforting the living as honouring the dead. When the body finally left, carried out by coffin or cart, the bedroom returned to its ordinary function, though never quite the same. For families, the bed might forever echo with the knowledge of what it once held. And as you look at the Victorian bedroom through this lens, you see why these spaces were never merely for rest. They bore witness to the entire arc of life, from birth to sickness to death. Each transition marked not by hospitals or institutions, but by the same four walls and the same heavy curtains. The bed was cradle, battleground and shrine, adapting endlessly to the needs placed upon it. The shocking part is not that the Victorians hid secrets in their bedrooms. It is that their bedrooms hid every stage of existence, compressing the most sacred and the most grotesque into one ordinary room. If the Victorian bedroom could host death, it also hosted the opposite. Birth was as much a domestic event as burial, and the same bed that staged a shrouded corpse might, only months earlier, have been the site of sweat, blood, and wailing life. Hospitals were rarely involved unless things went badly, and even then women often resisted being moved. The bedroom was safer in their eyes, familiar and modest, a place where family hovered and midwives bustled about with their baskets of mysterious tools and herbal tonics. For most women, childbirth was not just a private ordeal but a communal one. Female relatives gathered, sometimes in such numbers that the room became crowded and stifling. Curtains were drawn for modesty, fires stoked to keep the air warm, and the mother was positioned on her bed, gripping sheets, while midwives urged her through the ordeal. The husband was usually banished, his presence deemed unhelpful or even improper. This was female territory, and it came with its own rituals and codes of conduct. Mortality was the shadow that loomed over the scene. In the 19th century, maternal death rates were shockingly high. Some estimates suggest as many as 1 in 200 births ended with the mother's death, and even higher numbers suffered permanent injury. The word confinement was not only about modesty, but about risk, a recognition that pregnancy and delivery carried real danger. The Victorian bedroom, therefore, was as likely to echo with cries of grief as cries of joy. Medical science did not make things easier, at least not at first. Doctors who attended births often carried infection from other patients, and the lack of hand washing turned childbirth into a game of microbial roulette. Puerperal fever, a postpartum infection, claimed countless lives. Many women who had survived pregnancy and labour succumbed to it days later, burning with fever in the very bed where their infant nursed beside them. The irony of progress was brutal. Hospitals introduced higher death rates than home births. So many families clung to tradition. For pain relief, the bedroom became a testing ground. In the mid-19th century, chloroform and ether made their appearance, and Queen Victoria famously accepted chloroform during the birth of Prince Leopold in 1853. Her approval shifted public opinion, and suddenly the use of anaesthetics in childbirth carried not scandal, but royal endorsement. Of course, most women could not afford such luxuries, relying instead on laudanum, herbal brews, or sheer endurance. Some clutched crucifixes, others bit down on cloth, and all endured with a resilience that was expected rather than admired. The tools of childbirth found their way into bedrooms as well. Forceps, heavy and gleaming, were sometimes carried in discreet cases by doctors. Their use was both life-saving and horrifying, pulling infants into the world at the risk of crushing skulls or tearing mothers. Midwives, by contrast, leaned on herbal knowledge. Pennyroyal and raspberry leaf teas, castor oil rubs, and endless patience formed their toolkit. The clash between traditional midwifery and emerging medical authority played out right there in the bedchamber, with mothers caught between two philosophies of care. After delivery, the bedroom took on another role, that of nursery. The infant, often swaddled tightly, shared the bed with the mother for warmth. Cradles, when present, were tucked close, but co-sleeping was common despite the risks. Wet nurses might be brought in if the mother could not or would not nurse, and their presence added another layer of intrigue. In wealthier homes, wet nurses were sometimes dismissed as improper influences, yet their milk was prized, and infants thrived under their care. The Victorian bedroom thus expanded its function, becoming not only a site of labour, but of early parenting. The rituals of postpartum care were peculiar. Women were expected to remain in confinement for weeks, even months, avoiding exertion and visitors. Curtains stayed drawn, meals were brought to the bed, and silence was encouraged to let the mother heal. For some, this confinement became a prison of tedium, while for others it was a rare chance to be relieved of domestic duties. Either way, the bedroom absorbed it, becoming a cocoon where life slowed to a crawl. Childbirth also intersected with morality in unsettling ways. Illegitimate births were hidden, sometimes with women labouring in secret rooms to avoid scandal. Infanticide was a grim shadow, as desperate mothers sometimes abandoned or smothered newborns rather than face social disgrace. The Victorian bedroom in these cases became a place of silence, the cries of infants muffled or concealed. Courts were filled with cases of concealment of birth, and newspapers relished the scandal. For every celebrated royal delivery, there were dozens of hidden tragedies behind curtained windows. The sensory world of the birthing bedroom was unforgettable. The smell of sweat, blood, and paraffin lamps, the sound of moaning, whispered prayers, and midwives issuing brisk instructions, the sight of sheets stained, then hurriedly replaced, the presence of neighbours, sisters and mothers, all lending their strength, if not their comfort. And always the looming knowledge that this was not guaranteed joy, but a gamble, one in which both mother and child might lose. Yet for all its terrors, childbirth was woven into the fabric of Victorian domestic life. The bedroom was not merely a stage for sleep or sex or sickness, but for the first breath of countless lives. Every nursery rhyme, every lullaby, every cradle rocked in the corner began here. The shocking secret is not only that these intimate dramas unfolded so routinely in bedrooms, but that they did so with a frankness we can scarcely imagine today. Where modern childbirth is sanitised, medicalised, and often hidden behind hospital doors, Victorians lived and died by the bed, facing the raw truth of reproduction in its most unfiltered form. And so the Victorian bedroom stands revealed again, not as a private refuge, but as a theatre where the most primal forces of life and death took their turns. One day a deathbed draped in flowers, another day a birthbed soaked in sweat, and always the cycle repeated within the same four walls. To understand these rooms is to understand the Victorians themselves, a society obsessed with respectability, but forced to confront the messiness of existence in their most intimate spaces. Marriage in the Victorian era did not begin with flowers and violins. It began with paperwork, property, and then the bedroom. Weddings might be celebrated in grand churches or modest chapels, but the real theatre of union came later, under the sheets, or at least under the heavy canopy of a four-poster bed. The first night together carried expectations not just for the couple, but for families and communities watching from the shadows, eager to see proof of consummation. A marriage was not truly valid without it, and the bedroom became the stage where legality, morality, and biology were supposed to merge into one very awkward performance. The idea of privacy was already tenuous, but on wedding nights it often evaporated entirely. In some circles, especially among aristocrats, newlyweds were practically escorted to their bedroom by relatives who lingered just long enough to make sure the ritual had begun. In lower-class households, families crowded into small homes where paper-thin walls left little mystery. Curtains and blankets provided the illusion of modesty, but the truth was that consummation was a public duty disguised as a private act. Imagine trying to create romance when half your family is sitting downstairs listening for creaks in the ceiling. Victorian morality layered shame and duty in equal measure. Women were expected to approach their first night with modesty, even fear, as purity was a prized commodity. Men, by contrast, were encouraged to be assertive, if not outright forceful, because hesitation could be seen as weakness. The imbalance of expectations made the wedding night more of a test than a celebration. A bride who resisted too much risked being labelled frigid. A groom who failed to perform risked ridicule, whispers, and even annulment proceedings. The stakes were absurdly high for an act that most people barely understood, thanks to the lack of formal sex education. That ignorance was not accidental. Victorian society cloaked sexuality in euphemism, leaving young people to piece together the mechanics from gossip, novels, and whispered advice. Some bridal guides hinted at what might happen, but couched everything in vague metaphors about flowers, bees, and gardens. Actual knowledge of anatomy was rare, leading to disastrous encounters where expectations collided with biology. Medical professionals even published pamphlets warning men not to indulge too frequently with their wives, claiming it would drain their vitality and doom their children to weakness. The result was a culture of fear where desire was rebranded as disease and marital intimacy became something to ration like sugar. Fertility, however, was the unavoidable goal. Producing heirs, especially male ones, was not just a personal matter, but a family obligation. The Victorian bedroom was filled with superstitions about improving chances of conception. Some believed certain positions increased the likelihood of boys, others recommended specific diets heavy on meat or oysters. Herbal remedies promised to strengthen wombs or invigorate sperm. At the same time, women quietly experimented with ways to avoid pregnancy, from sponges soaked in vinegar to rudimentary condoms made of animal intestines. These attempts were whispered about but rarely acknowledged publicly. Respectable couples were supposed to welcome every child as a divine blessing, even if their household was already bursting with mouths to feed. The presence of contraception, though officially condemned, was undeniable. Condoms, often called French letters, circulated in secret, sold by pharmacists and sometimes even discreetly advertised in coded language. The rubber vulcanization process introduced by Charles Goodyear in the 1840s made them more durable, and although they were marketed primarily for disease prevention, couples quickly recognized their other uses. Yet moralists railed against them, claiming they encouraged promiscuity and undermined marriage. This tension turned the Victorian bedroom into a battleground between morality and practicality, with couples caught in the middle, weighing the risks of discovery against the risks of endless children. For those unable to conceive, the shame was suffocating. Infertility was rarely seen as a medical problem, and more often blamed on the woman's supposed weakness or lack of virtue. Remedies ranged from the absurd to the dangerous, including electric shock treatments, bizarre tonics, and even visits to spiritualists who claimed to restore reproductive harmony. Men, meanwhile, rarely shouldered the blame, despite the very real possibility of low fertility. The bedroom became a quiet arena of disappointment, frustration, and whispered blame. Beyond fertility, the newlywed bedroom also reflected Victorian obsession with morality and appearances. Marital manuals instructed men to control their desires, warning that too much indulgence would lead to insanity, blindness, or worse. Women were advised to tolerate intimacy as a wifely duty, not a source of pleasure. The result was a culture where genuine affection and passion were often hidden beneath layers of duty and silence. Yet beneath those layers, humanity persisted. diaries and letters reveal that many couples did discover intimacy, sometimes joyfully, sometimes clumsily, but always in defiance of the rigid moral codes pressed upon them. The sensory world of a wedding night was as unglamorous as it was nerve-wracking. Heavy curtains trapped heat, making the air stifling. Corsets and multiple layers of clothing turned undressing into a logistical ordeal, with hooks, buttons and laces requiring careful navigation before anything could actually happen. Candlelight flickered unevenly, casting nervous shadows on the walls. The creak of the bed frame seemed to echo louder than a church bell, a sound that could betray everything to listeners beyond the door. Romance, such as it was, often drowned beneath embarrassment, fear, and the weight of expectation. Yet within this awkwardness lay the true secret of the Victorian bedroom. Behind the sermons and the medical warnings, behind the corsets and the curtains, people still tried to figure each other out. Some failed miserably. Others forged connections that transcended the nonsense written in guides and manuals. The wedding night, like much of Victorian life, was a performance layered over raw human need. And while society obsessed over propriety, the bedroom quietly recorded the messy, fumbling reality of human intimacy. The Victorian bedroom was not a temple of romance, but a crucible of obligation, fear, and resilience. Its shocking secret was not only that it hid consummation rituals from prying eyes, but that it did so while broadcasting them in whispers, creaks, and stained sheets to a community eager for confirmation. Every wedding night was both a personal moment and a public verdict, a test of bodies and reputations that played out under the dim glow of gaslight and the watchful ears of neighbours. And that, my friends, is the end of tonight's little tour through the lace-draped madness of Victorian bedrooms. If you enjoyed learning how the past somehow managed to be both prudish and wildly unhinged at the same time, do me a favour. Let me know down in the comments which historical nightmare you want me to drag you through next. Maybe medieval diets, maybe pirate hygiene, maybe something even worse. And if you haven't had your fill of historical suffering yet, go ahead and check out my other videos. There's plenty of grime, absurdity and discomfort to keep you company until you drift off to sleep.